Chapter 2, the masculine/feminine. Are men and women different? In today's world, you're told that they are completely different and completely the same. When the world decides they must be different, you're told a person could feel like a man or a woman on the inside, despite not having the proper equipment on the outside. This, according to the world's advice, means that the equipment of the body must be engineered to reflect how the person feels on the inside, let alone the changing up of hair, clothing, makeup, mannerisms, etc., to present oneself as fitting the stereotype. Yet, when we attempt to show differences in capabilities, the sexes magically become the same. Voices in culture say we cannot possibly separate people by gender or sex, and if we do, we are being discriminatory and must be merely imagining the performance differences between the two. This confusion becomes dangerously seeded into the collective psyche of society. If we no longer know the truth, that men and women have differences, then we can't possibly recognize how to raise boys. The formula for both becomes a simple one-size-fits-all answer. While I'd rather not get into gender within the confines of a book dedicated to developing a man from a boy, I feel it's now necessary. You as a parent need to know that the traditional values of humanity have prescribed us a true way of looking at the world. What does that mean? You're not crazy for believing something deep down, despite what the world tells you. Masculine and feminine differences exist, and knowing how and why will provide every person a direction forward when attempting to develop themselves or their son. The goal of developing a man is fulfilling the masculine within him, and this cannot be done if we're using a generic, female-centric manual. That's like using the wrong car manual. You could lay out a manual for a Ford when working on a Chevy, and plenty of the directions could be useful. However, when you try to start the motor up, you'll find that if it works, it won't work for long. Plenty of crossover happens within the fundamentals, but the details truly do matter. The torque specs of the bolts on the Chevy might be different from the Ford, and that could be the difference between a high-performing motor and a head blowing off the block. In the spirit of a treatise, let's first figure out if the masculine/man and feminine/woman are, in fact, different from each other. Are they different? The feminist movement has shown itself in various forms over the decades. One might even argue over the centuries. It has grown, shifted, and modified itself over the decades as society and culture changed around it. At one point, the major feminist campaign revolved around the prohibition of alcohol. In the 1820s and 30s, a religious revivalist movement sprang up across the U.S. and took hold. This movement believed alcohol was a cause of sinful and immoral behavior. They went as far as to call alcohol a national curse. Such a movement bolstered prohibition and concerned itself with other social causes. Groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League fought against alcohol in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. They were sure to use social activism and sometimes even resort to violence against saloons and bars to help usher in a new society, void of the social ills that alcohol caused. Women heavily populated these movements, believing that alcohol was the central cause of so many of their issues. They considered domestic abuse, debauchery, senseless wasting of money, gambling, and other vices all attributable to alcohol's effect on their men. But women weren't just championing the era of prohibition. They were also participating in the suffrage movement as early as the 1840s. Despite the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave the vote to Black Americans, sex was not included in the amendment. Now, it must be noted, there was never a national restriction against women voting. For instance, in 1776, New Jersey considered all inhabitants eligible to vote if they were worth 50 pounds and met the residency and age requirements. In 1790 and 1797, they even include the words he or she. Just in case a purist is reading, yes, New Jersey did restrict voting to males only in 1807. When women pushed forward, an amendment was proposed in 1878 regarding women's suffrage, but it was rejected. During the Progressive era of the early 1900s, the suffrage movement gained steam and aggression, culminating in the 19th Amendment being ratified in 1920. So why the history lesson? The women's rights movement did not stop there. Despite the victories with various social issues, they never claimed ultimate victory and settled back into the routine of life. The fight continued, taking shape in different ways. During World War II, you saw the icon Rosie the Riveter gain popularity because she stood for an idea. Men were away at war, but someone needed to build the machinery and equipment used to fight the war. Women's participation in the economy was nothing new, but it gave the feminist movement a new angle to work with. By the 1960s, you saw a massive push against the domesticity of the 1950s woman, even though a third of women participated in the labor force during that time. In the 1960s and forward, the feminist movement took on a massive platform. They announced that women should be just as career-oriented as men. They can do the same thing men can do and should be just as successful in careers and academics as men. Messaging to young women became career first, family later, or you can have it all. As young women went to college and grew up, the burden of getting wins in the war of the sexes rested upon their shoulders. The sexual revolution, the invention of the birth control pill, no-fault divorce, the expanded welfare state, and philosophies such as postmodernism brought the woman into center focus when discussing everything going on in society. The power of a successful career and economic independence became the ultimate goal of the feminist movement, along with detaching from the nuclear family and removing the responsibility of child rearing. But we still need to know if women were built to pursue careers in the same way men were. Were they built to put off motherhood and reject the traditional family structure? In 2019, 51% of law students were women, and yet women only made up 22% of partners in firms. Stats such as these caused plenty of consternation and fodder for the feminist arguments that claimed discrimination and bias as the root cause. They determined that the good old boys club had closed its doors to women and the patriarchy was to blame. In their minds, if all things were equal, we would have 51% of partners being female and a minority of males, especially white ones, at the top. However, if we look closer at the numbers, we find something else that could explain a major factor causing the issue. On average, a law student graduates at the age of 26. While the range tends to be 22 to 30, we can safely say 26 is the generally accepted average. Again, working with averages takes about 10 years to become a partner at your average law firm. That means the average age of a partner is about 36 or so. Now, many of you have probably recognized the issue. Any woman reading this who is past the age of 35, 36 will know what they were most likely feeling at that moment. It's apparent to many women and to men who are paying attention. It's something that goes beyond desire and gets into the scientific nature of humanity. When a woman is 36 or so, the biological clock is ticking. She knows that a chance at a family and raising her children is frittering away at the moment. Many women look at their age and realize that the career isn't worth it when compared to the beauty and fulfillment found in raising a family. And in case you want to yell, that's sexist, let's look at what Reuters reports about the issue. Reuters reported that the number one factor pushing women from the law profession into other lines of work was work-family conflict. Number two, stress. 2/3 of women reported moderate to severe stress, while less than half of men reported the same reason. In other words, the conflict between a woman's profession and the biological calling of a family comes to a crossroads. And most women do not see the value in becoming 70 or 80 years old with a bunch of career achievements and little to no family depth. The second reason points to a difference in construction at the biological level in men versus women. Not that women can't handle stress in a highly stressful field, and not that men can automatically handle it. However, the majority of men are hardwired to handle higher levels of career-specific stress versus women who handle other kinds of stress in better ways than the average man. Women in the law profession may be battling against a good old boys network, but that is not the biggest cause. Women are biologically and spiritually hardwired to lean towards nourishing and raising families. By 36, if a woman has been pursuing a career nonstop, she most likely has not been pursuing a family. Many women are finding themselves too far along to have children and build a family because they bought the feminist movement's lie that women must have a career similar to a man's to lead a fulfilling life. The feminist movement tells women they're designed to be the same as men, which is just flat wrong. Men and women are different biologically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We're wired to be different. And the beautiful truth is that when men and women connect in union, the traits of both unite to create a very powerful unit that can do so much more than on their own. Our brains are wired to work differently. Our muscles are different. Our skeletons are different. Our hip-to-waist ratio is different. The insertion points of our limbs are different. Our hormones are finely tuned to create drastic changes. A woman's normal testosterone range is 15 to 70 nanograms per deciliter. A man's is 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. That's not a typo, nor is it an exaggeration. Imagine the effect that such a load of testosterone can have on a body. Consider the effects of it from the womb till a body is fully developed. You get the idea that we're not just looking at feeling differently. The battle between feminism and masculinity takes shape when women are told they don't need a man, and men are told to be quiet, sit down, and act more feminine. When the term toxic masculinity gets levied at men, it's often accompanied by the insinuation that the opposite traits would be more useful in men. After all, 93% of federal inmates are men, and only 6.8% are women. This type of statistic has been used as a bludgeon against masculinity and in favor of drawing out more feminine characteristics in men. But did you know that 97% of science Nobel Prize winners are men, while 3% are women? Since 2000, 11 have gone to women and 185 to men. People quickly point to sex discrimination when discussing Nobel Prizes. However, not too often do you hear that the justice system is sexist against men. If men and women are 50-50 of the population, it stands to reason that they would be equally represented in prisons as well as Nobel Prizes, unless something else was going on. The differences between men and women when confronting IQ show rather drastically. While women are more closely grouped towards the mean, men are spread further out along the bell curve. This means that while more women than men are of average intelligence, the extremes are more often occupied by men. This is not to say that highly intelligent women and extremely low intelligent women do not exist, but more of each extreme does exist in the male category. Unfortunately, when discussing prison terms for men, we don't discuss the influence of lower IQ, lack of fathers, or cultural effects. We immediately point to toxic masculinity as the culprit. Toxic masculinity. Despite supposedly having no differences to speak of, popular culture loves laying the accusation of toxic masculinity at the feet of any man who does not fit the new culture's definition of what a man should be. In other words, culture is now telling men, women are no different from you, except those nasty parts of you that need to be changed. And just as a short aside, we must understand that there are elements of culture and society that stand strong in the gap against something like toxic masculinity. Unfortunately, our popular media, academia, professional organizations, and public figures are attaching themselves to such preposterous ideas. And so, we must have a coherent and powerful rejection of these ideas. These pillars of society then determine that a solution to toxic masculinity must be found, and the textbook definition of toxic masculinity is trotted out. Psychologists, professors, and journalists claim that these men who sit in federal prisons are there because society has conditioned them to be toxic dangers. Removing those toxic masculine traits, as defined by the American Psychological Association, would result in all prisons closing and everybody holding hands. No more war, no more rapes, no assaults. John Lennon would sing about it and we'd all flash peace signs. What are those toxic traits that the American Psychological Association determined needed to be trotted out in their first real attempt at guiding how to counsel men? What are those traits that are so unbelievably dangerous that they are the root of all evil in the world? Aggression, dominance, stoicism, and competitiveness. But let's just take a moment and think about the antonyms of those words. Stoicism. The antonyms are emotional, fervent, complaining, impatient. Would you want your husband to be complaining, emotional, and impatient? How about competitiveness? Those antonyms include apathy, half-heartedness, indifference, unconcern, idleness, indolence, inertia, and laziness. I tell you, every woman dreams of a man who has indifference, idleness, and laziness as his foundational traits. Or perhaps dominance. Such antonyms would be helplessness, weakness, impotence, impotency, and powerlessness. You see, taking these words and looking at the opposite of them gives us a bleak, depressing picture of a man. Words like aggression, dominance, and competitiveness sound like obvious root causes of men's violent natures. So much so that the American Psychological Association has signed on to support this outlook of toxic masculinity and has determined that psychologists must attempt to work these nasty, awful, horrible traits out of men. Supposedly, because they will be the fulfillment of their potential if they're apathetic, idle, lazy, helpless, weak, and impatient. The problem the APA cannot get around rests in the truth that these traits are inherent in a man at the biological level. These traits cannot just be counseled out of a man, with expectations that the man will become more confident, loving, self-assured, and competent. The APA will never create a more robust and developed man because they're resisting the traits that help drive a man to become more of who he ought to be. However, the APA has fallen into an imagination problem that many of us are guilty of as well. When people imagine these traits, they picture the most grotesque and extreme examples of such. They picture a man running down the street naked with a club in his hand and grabbing handfuls of anything he wants. They picture the hedonistic playboy who leaves a trail of destroyed people in his wake. They imagine the Wall Street super finance bro with white powder on his nose, a fifth of vodka in his hands, and beautiful blonde women all around him. Our imaginations run away with ourselves, and we leave behind the true nature of what it means to be a forged man. But be assured, when you understand what role those traits play, you'll see fathers, husbands, brothers, sons, and yourself in a whole new light. The father. As toxic masculinity is pressed into the minds of the next generation, it gives women an excuse to reject men wholesale, with claims that men are the destructive drones of the patriarchy. Through such an influence, Western civilization continues to do its best to remove the influence of the father from the family. Many who push this patriarchal narrative conveniently avoid the importance of the father in the home because to do so would undermine the feminist narrative that a woman does not need a man and can do anything he can do. If we admit that the father has a special effect on a child as they're growing up, we are all of a sudden, A, telling everybody that both men and women play a special role in the family unit, differences in the sexes, and B, that single mothers are somehow not enough. Men are needed. We can't avoid the effect of a father on a child, though. The stats are staggering. 43% of children in the United States are without a father. 90% of runaway and homeless children are from fatherless homes. 80% of rapists with rage come from a fatherless home. 70% of state facilities housed minors are from fatherless homes. 39% of inmates in jail came from a home with an absent father. The rate of abuse and neglect is 27.3 per thousand in single-parent households. It's 15.5 for two-parent households. Those statistics cannot be ignored. However, popular messaging continues to promote the idea that women just need to shed off the dead weight of their child's father. While that's bad, the generations of men who have agreed with the systemic endorsement of fatherless homes are even worse. After all, if a father in the 60s is suddenly given freedom from the burden of a child, what is he tempted to decide? What about if he's told that the mother and child will be better off financially and supported if he's not around? If he's given the green light to run amok, leaving fatherless children in his wake? How could he not think long and hard about remaining an eternal boy and seeking what he desires over the responsibilities of life? We've watched the destruction of the role of the father in the family, and it has not been merely at the hands of individual movements within society. The government certainly put its hat in the ring and created massive programs to help speed along the decay of the family. Unfortunately, many did not realize that the moves they were making would spell doom for the American family. As usual, our politicians did not think ahead when advancing an agenda. Lyndon B. Johnson stunningly advanced the welfare state, as he made it his mission to leave behind a massive legacy. Now, we all agree he did leave his mark, though some may argue that the legacy he left behind was more of an infamous legacy when we tally up the damage done. Myths surround the 1960s, and most likely none more so than the idea that the black community began to finally progress with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the War on Poverty. The truth is much clearer. From 1940 to 1960, the poverty rate among the black community fell from 87% to 47% by 1960. During those times, most black children were being raised in a two-parent household. By the 1990s, the majority of black children were being raised by a single parent, and most often the mother. But this was not the case just for a single racial community. Whites and Hispanics have had to deal with their own problems, considering illegitimacy has exploded for them as well. Divorce rates in single-parent households skyrocketed in all communities. After the 60s, and many placed the blame at the feet of the Johnson administration and the progressive movement fighting for sexual liberty, an expanded welfare state, no-fault divorce, and a growing feminist movement. And there's reason to believe that this attack on masculinity and fathers is not an accident.